podcast 1844 are especially happy to interview on this date dear Kristine Leonard. She is the granddaughter of Mrs. Leonora Armstrong, that in February 2021 we will be celebrating the 100th anniversary of his arrival in Brazil, bringing the message of Baha'u'llah to the unity of the human race. Welcome, dear Kristine. Tell us a little about your family ties with Leonora Armstrong.
Well, Leonora was my grandmother Aleth's older sister. They were only 19 months apart in age, born in 1895 and 1897, respectively. My mother, Karen, was Aleth's only child, born in 1935. And my sister and I are Karen's only children. Leonora never had any natural children of her own, having married Uncle Harold later in life. But she had many, many adopted children throughout Brazil over the years.
What memories do we have of Dona Leonora?
My first meeting with my great-aunt Leonora was in 1968 when I was 10 years old. This was also the very first time that my mother, at age 33, had ever met her aunt. We traveled to Brazil, my mother, father, little sister, and I, staying first in Rio for a night before finding the bus up to Juiz de Fora. This was also only 2 years after my grandmother Aleth had passed away, and she and Leonora had been planning a long visit together when the dreadful news reached them. So this visit with my mother Karen, her only living relatives left to her, was supremely important. Yet, as things often turn out, she was nursing her youngest adopted son with the flu, and consequently she came down sick as well. Then slowly we all started getting sick, and we had to cut our visit short. Poor Aunt Leonora missed even the last few days we were there as she was in bed, but we had moved closer to Brazil by this time, and my father was an airline pilot with good discounts on travel, so we promised to make more visits. My mother, father, and sister made 2 more visits during the early 1970s, and then in 1977, we moved to Iquitos, Peru, which is on the Amazon River above Manaus. This was when we had a visit from Aunt Leonora at our home in Peru, and I returned to Brazil with her after she attended the International Women's Conference in December 1977 in Lima. We made an epic journey together, flying to Manaus, then by boat down the Amazon River to Belém, her 3rd trip up the Amazon, by the way, then by bus from Belém to Bahia, and then down to Belo Horizonte and Juiz de Fora. I stayed with her for 5 months, and this is when I got to know her the best. Question number 2. Another memory of my Aunt Leonora was when the Hands of the Cause had written to her that she must attend the dedication of the first Baha'i house of worship to be dedicated in Latin America. And then Mr. Kadem contacted my mother and insisted that she make sure that my great-aunt was there. So my parents hatched a plan where they knew they would be able to be sure that Aunt Leonora would not be able to change her mind. They made all the plane reservations and the hotel reservations, and even told her that if she needed help, my mother would fly to Rio and travel back with her to Panama. It took months of planning, but it worked. And in April 1972, we met Aunt Leonora when she arrived for the dedication of the first Latin American Baha'i temple. We stayed in the same hotel with her, as Ruhia Khanum had instructed my mother to make sure Aunt Leonora was staying in the same hotel she was in so they could visit. My father was her personal chauffeur, and they had some special engagements planned for her that he took care of. Every heart was touched when she was introduced at the arena session as the mother of the Baha'is of Brazil and South America. As who could imagine this huge Baha'i family of that continent resulting from those bent, frail, small shoulders?
Was Mrs. Leonora's entire family Baha'i?
Well, my great-aunt Leonora was not the first Baha'i in her family. Her grandmother Sterling had discovered the Baha'i Revelation, as it was called back then, in 1906. She deepened in the faith by corresponding with many other Baha'is, such as Isabella Brittingham and Louise Waite, also known as Shahnaz. They would ask questions of each other and share answers, as well as tablets or prayers of Abdu'l-Baha written out by hand. Grandma Sterling also had several visits with Abdu'l-Baha when he was in America during 1912. The young girl's mother, Grace Sterling Holsapple, had died when they were only 3 and 5 years old. She had died of diabetes before they understood the disease, and the whole family was plunged into heartbreak. Their father was lost to grief and alcohol, so their grandmothers both helped raise them. Their grandmother Holsapple died a few years after their mother, so their grandmother Sterling was the one who influenced them the most, raising them with the principles of Baha'u'llah. Leonora and her sister grew up as young girls, learning prayers and singing early Baha'i music. So, in answer to your question, Leonora's father never found the Baha'i Revelation. Her mother had passed away in 1900, but Alith and her husband, Carl Sigurd Hogberg, their daughter Karin, son-in-law Bob, 2 granddaughters, and grandsons-in-law, and numerous great-grandchildren are all Baha'is.
You must have grown up listening to the wonderful stories of your great-aunt's pioneering spirit. Who were these stories?
I think when I was younger, I had no idea what my great-aunt had done as a pioneer. Indeed, when she left America to travel to Brazil by herself in 1921, it wasn't called pioneering even. She was answering the call of Abdu'l-Baha in his Tablets of the Divine Plan, where he had called everyone to spread across the world and tell of Baha'u'llah. She was only 24 when she heard these tablets read out loud in New York City, and she was on her way to Brazil by the time she was 25. As a young woman, though, in those days, you simply did not do that kind of thing. Her father was horrified at the thought that his eldest daughter would venture alone without a chaperone to parts unknown. But he thought that maybe if he humored her, she would come home having gotten her desire for adventure over. So she departed on a steamboat in January 1921 for the 2-week voyage to Brazil, having no friends, nor even knowing the Portuguese language. She had only the name and address for a theosophist in Santos that Martha Root had given to her. Well, it wasn't until I was about 22 years old and my great-aunt had passed away the previous year that I investigated some of the letters that were held at the Baha'i World Center and received a huge package of photocopies in the mail. They were copies of the tablets she had received from Abdu'l-Baha and the pile of letters she had received from Shoghi Effendi. I was positively floored. And this was the beginning of my research into my great-aunt's life. This is when I began to realize how shy and timid she had been, but how it did not match up with the bravery of what she did and the glory of what she had accomplished. Another story of my great-aunt was that she and my grandmother were young girls in their teenage years when their grandmother Sterling suggested Leonora apply to serve at Greenacre Baha'i School in Maine as a summer volunteer. We have several letters between their grandmother and Alfred Lunt, who was on the committee planning the summer sessions. First, Leonora was asked if she would like to serve in Fellowship House for the summer of 1917. But she was already graduated from Cornell University and busy teaching Latin at high schools near her hometown of Hudson. And before a decision could be reached by the Board of Trustees to confirm the start date of her time at the school, she had found an important career-related job in Boston for the summer. And so she suggested that her younger sister, Alith, might like to take her place. So it ended up being my grandmother, Alith, who went to Fellowship House at Greenacre in June of 1917 to work as a housekeeper's helper for the summer sessions. She was to be helper to Mrs. Flexner, who was the hostess for the season. She was to, quote, wait on table, to help somewhat in the kitchen and in the chambers. So some of these photos show both Leonora and Alith at that time, and some show Leonora at Greenacre in 1920, pictured with Mrs. Elizabeth Greenleaf, who was an active Baha'i teacher at that time.
Did you visit her in Brazil in what year? What memories do you have of this visit?
My second visit with Aunt Leonora was made from December 1977 to May of 1978 and was a major turning point in my life. She was 83 years old by then and quite frail, but she insisted on us making this epic journey by plane, riverboat, and bus, returning from Peru to her home in Juiz de Fora. She had accustomed herself to great hardship. Even with her arthritis, scoliosis of her back, difficulties with sleep, and other discomforts, she would not worry about any of these discomforts on her part. It was a battle even for me to be able to do small favors for her. She would insist on doing them for herself. And of course, as a 19-year-old girl, I had been instructed by my mother to be of service to my great aunt for the entire time I was with her. So when I say struggle, I mean struggle. And as things often turn out differently from our expectations, my 5 months in Brazil, supposedly helping my great aunt, were spent traveling and visiting other Baha'is in the region. She thought that I should be with other young people, as she would say, and she arranged for me to live with various families and to attend the summer school. And in all fairness, she had a huge job awaiting her when we arrived, as her house had not been finished as planned, and there was no room for me. There was plaster all over the rooms, and her things were piled in the middle. The furniture was all covered in builder's dust. And even though I would start cleaning at things, she wanted to be able to catch up on all her correspondence and her translation work desperately, and keep an eye on the builders at the same time. She worried less about me when I was staying with other friends. She knew correctly also that I was not used to the discomforts that she put herself through and did not want to inflict them on me.
You wrote a book dedicated to the life of your illustrious relative. Tell us about that book. Do you have any prediction of when it will be published in English? It is in Portuguese?
So, from when I received those first letters from the Baha'i World Center in 1981 until June of 2019, I was researching and writing about my great Aunt Leonora's life. It really was 38 years of researching and writing, and it was all done in the middle of my pioneering life, raising of 3 children, being widowed twice, and moving between 3 continents. But it's also been the core of my life, in that by working on it continually, it has formed my own character. I've learned about my heritage, but most of all, I've been blessed with following Dona Leonora's footsteps as she grew and challenged herself consistently, always asking the guardian first if she should move ahead, for instance, with plans for an orphanage in Bahia, or move to Spain to learn Spanish better, or leave Brazil altogether because she could make more money in America. Any time that I ever despaired at being able to complete a book on my great aunt's life, I would be reminded by her resolve, by her highly meritorious services, her heroic self-sacrifice, her unflinching faith, and untiring and fruitful labors, as Shoghi Effendi wrote about them, and I would in turn be inspired to keep persevering. So this completed and rather large manuscript was submitted to George Ronald Publishers last June 2019 in English. There is no word yet as to when it will be published, but I am hopeful that it will be soon and that it will be arranged to have it translated into Portuguese and Spanish as soon as possible after that. I am also rather excited about the wealth of photographs and supporting documents, such as newspaper articles from the first countries she visited on her voyages during the 1920s, that might be included in the book. It was quite a surprise to me, after creating a list at one point just a few years ago, that Dona Leonora had opened up 9 countries to the Baha'i faith. She would never have told that to anybody on her own. So, okay, of course we are all curious. Those countries are Brazil, Haiti, Curacao, Colombia, Venezuela, Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, and Barbados. But you will have to see the book to learn the details of these visits. One of the aspects of Leonora's service to the Baha'i cause that was not very evident, well, she rarely talked about it, and only after Mr. Hooper Dunbar insisted she tell some of her Amazon travels did we get the slightest idea, was her extensive travel teaching work. In her later years, Leonora lamented how she did so little in the way of travel teaching, because she was so busy with translation work and correspondence, and later all of her counselor duties. But she was comparing her later years' teaching work to what she had done during the 1920s. And once you take a survey of her ship voyages, over 8 long voyages, where she stopped in as many ports as possible within her itinerary, visiting with newspaper publishers, governors, mayors, judges, professors, theosophist groups, ministers, and all manner of people on board her ships, then you begin to get a picture of the immense scope of work she was determined to do. Remember, she was a shy and timid person, but she would get into conversations with people who could not understand what such a young girl was doing traveling by herself in South America. Thus, you can read some of the newspaper articles that begin with, quote, "Intelligent and cultured, Miss Leonora has been conducting lectures in several states of Brazil," or "Pro-feminism, a great Yankee feminist among us," or "The lecturer is a young woman of rare culture, speaking several languages, and dedicated to the arduous task of teaching Brazil the Baha'i Creed." She was called "this illustrious writer and lecturer," but she was using the talks and tablets of Abdu'l-Baha, outlining the need for peace and fellowship of all mankind. Some of the places that Leonora visited that were outside of Brazil were Georgetown, British Guiana, now called Guyana; Paramaribo, Dutch Guiana, now called Suriname; Port of Spain, Trinidad; Caracas and Puerto Cabello, Venezuela; Willemstad, Curacao; Puerto Colombia, Cartagena, and Barranquilla in Colombia; Panama City, Panama, Bridgetown, Barbados, Port-au-Prince, Haiti, Dakar, Senegal, Algiers and Oran in Algeria, Gibraltar, Barcelona, Madrid, and Seville in Spain, Haifa, Palestine, Port Said, Egypt, and Lisbon, Portugal. These were all during her voyages of 1927 and 1930, and were what I termed as her epic journeys. Later in 1933, she traveled to Los Angeles, California to visit her family, who had relocated from the east to the west coasts of the United States. In 1972, she had made the trip by air to Panama for the dedication of the first Baha'i House of Worship in Latin America, then to Miami, Florida, and Nassau, Bahamas. In all these places, she met people and talked about the faith and the many aspects of its teachings. During the 1970s, Leonora traveled to many cities in Brazil and around South America for counselor meetings, conferences, and teaching projects. By this decade, she was well into her 80s, but she visited every single country on the continent during that time.
What are the main characteristics, in your opinion, that Mrs. Leonora?
By characteristics, I think you must mean Dona Leonora's qualities. Well, the first thing I think of is a photograph that I found showing Dona Leonora speaking in a room full of people. It was crowded, and they were all seated all around her, and even all along the floor right up to her feet. They were seated at her feet, yet her body is bent and her face mild and sweet-looking. And by this time, she was a counselor and was asked to speak at lots of gatherings. But speaking was her most feared event when she was younger, and she used to prepare her talks using Abdu'l-Baha's words straight out of Paris Talks, the book. During the 1970s, her last decade with us, she traveled and wrote and spoke constantly, yet her whole being was one of pure sincerity. She was deferential, modest, unassuming, soft-spoken, self-sacrificing, unpretentious, self-deprecating, and meek on the outside. Yet when she spoke from a powerful spirit, which is what must have given her the energy to continue as she did through all her frailties and eventual struggle with cancer. I think that her first 20 years on the continent as the lone Baha'i, with only letters of encouragement from Shoghi Effendi, Ruhia Khanum, May Maxwell, and her sister Alith, that her spirit grew in strength from constant tests, illness, and deprivations.
Have you corresponded over time? What were these letters about?
Yes, actually, I started writing letters to Aunt Leonora when I was a teenager because my parents were moving and I was in university in the United States, and letters were hard for my mother to write when she had no idea where they were going to be. So at one point, I also had an assignment for university, which I asked my great aunt about by letter. And she responded beautifully with a short history of the women in our family. I think it was possibly the seed for the larger project of writing her biography. I also kept a journal of the time that I was with her in Brazil, and my sister kept my letters to her from that time as well, giving me lots of background material.
Who are the other members of Mrs. Leonora family still alive? Where do they reside?
The only living members of Dona Leonora are truly my sister Cindy, who lives in Southern California, and myself here in Alaska. We each have 3 children, but they were all born after Dona Leonora had passed away. My niece is named for Aunt Leonora, as are many, many women throughout Brazil. Hopefully, our children and grandchildren will be able to learn more about their great-great-aunt by reading the upcoming book on her life.
Consider that on February 1st, 2021, the first centenary of the arrival of your great aunt to Brazil will take place. Become the first Baha'i to reside in South America. What is your message to the thousands of Brazilian Baha'is?
What a great question. May I answer it with a quote from Ruhi Kanu? It would be appropriate for the thousands of spiritual Baha'i children of Dona Leonora in Brazil and South America and Central America, as well as for the Baha'is of the entire world. The quote starts, "The study of such a life as Leonora's, a life of complete consecration to Baha'u'llah and his teachings, a life of ceaseless work which lasted till a few hours before her passing at the age of 85, a life in which it never even occurred to Leonora that she was sacrificing. Such a life is a manual for every generation of Baha'is to study and presents an enduring challenge to all those who would follow in her footsteps."
Dear Kristine, could you read for us one of the chapters of the book you wrote about the life of Dona Leonora and which will soon be released in English?
I was asked to read a little bit from the book about Leonora Holsapple Armstrong that is soon to be published. In trying to figure out which part to read, I thought, what better place to start than the beginning? So here's a little bit of reading from chapter 1. The Gifted Child. On the evening of 28 April 1919, a hush fell after the last strains of harp music left the hall, and an expectant atmosphere prevailed as a speaker moved to the front of the meeting room of the Hotel McAlpin. The estimated 600 delegates and friends gathered in New York City for the 11th Baha'i Convention and Congress had just enjoyed a feast together and a talk by Harlan Ober on the purposes and hopes of the Congress. The night air was alive with the excitement created only by the momentousness of the occasion, the revelation of the tablets of the divine plan of Abdu'l-Baha to the Western world. In this audience, filled with great expectation, sat a shy, studious, 23-year-old woman named Leonora Holsapple. An impressionable age to have been during the 4 years of the First World War and the influenza epidemic of the previous year. Concerned for the social plight of so many unfortunate people around her and across the world, these words of Abdu'l-Baha would have touched a chord on so many levels. Quote, "It is also recorded in the Blessed Gospel, 'Travel ye throughout the world and call ye the people to the kingdom of God.' Now this is the time that you may rise and perform this most great service and become the cause of the guidance of innumerable souls. Thus, through this superhuman service, the rays of peace and conciliation may illumine and enlighten all the regions, and the world of humanity may find peace and composure." And that's Abdu'l-Baha in Tablets of the Divine Plan, page 22. Leonora would have read this quote from the Bible as a young girl and possibly had it resonate with her on several levels. She said in later years, "The idea to go out as a pioneer first came to me at the Baha'i convention held in New York in 1919, when the tablets of the Divine Plan were given us, and I wrote to Abdu'l-Baha at once from there about this desire." 99 years ago, the tablets of the Divine Plan, written by Abdu'l-Baha, were the call to take the message of Baha'u'llah to all corners of the earth, and it is still the same for us today, as in the hidden words he writes, "Seize thy chance, for it will come to thee no more." Abdu'l-Baha said to not look on the degree of your capacity, nor to ask if you are worthy of the task. He said to rest your hopes on the help and loving kindness, the favors and bestowals of Baha'u'llah. He admonished us to urge on the steed of high endeavor over the field of sacrifice and carry away from this wide arena the prize of divine grace. In examining a life story, how can we be inspired by the efforts of this small, shy young woman of 1919? Her name was Leonora Sterling Holsapple of Hudson, New York. She was small in stature with dark hair and slightly downward sloping eyes set in a sweet heart-shaped face. She had been raised in part after her mother's unexpected death by her maternal grandmother, who had embraced the Baha'i revelation in 1906.
Dear Kristine Leonard, thank you so much for this wonderful, inspiring interview.
Thank you very much. Aloha pa to you all.